Thank you, Mr. Messmore, for those very kind words. My dear friends, it is an honor for me to stand here this morning to speak during this time of celebration, a day of celebration for you, graduates of St. David's School. It's not often that an infectious diseases physician is asked to speak at a high school graduation. Typically, when I mention what I do for a living, it's a conversation stopper. In this day of instant communication and media sound bites, I rarely get past my first sentence explaining what I do with microorganisms and infections before the conversation has well moved on. But suddenly, in the days of COVID-19, I've become a hot commodity. When I asked Mr. Hillegas about what he wanted me to speak about today, he graciously gave me free rein. So here I go, okay? But before I talk about infections, I want to talk about this school. I remember well my first St. David's graduation 15 years ago. I sat in the last row of some wobbly chairs set up on an uneven field not too far from where we are now sitting. My oldest daughter had just graduated from lower school, and she wanted to see her big buddy and the other graduates walk across the stage. And I wanted to honor many new friends and families we had come to know during our first year at the school. Even after only having been here for a year, we had been enfolded into a family. And like families, our lives at St. David's over the next 15 years were marked by many joys and some periods of sadness. We have seen older buildings disappear, and we have seen others literally rise out of the ground. And we have participated in the yearly bittersweet transitions that are part of all schools. New students come, and many well-loved students go. I, too, am a teacher. I teach people a little older than you, graduates, at Duke School of Medicine, and believe it or not, we as teachers come to love our students. But like parents, we raise our children and our students precisely for this moment when they will leave us one day. So while we will all miss you as you move on to new ventures, this is precisely the reason that we do what we do. We prepare you to leave us. So this is a momentous day. It's a graduation, a commencement. However, as we all know now, today, it is not a time for simple platitudes or well-worn wishes. Graduates, the world you are stepping into is completely different from the world you entered as rising seniors less than a year ago. I'm not telling you anything new. You know this. Your school year was completely disrupted in an unprecedented way. Our entire society was disrupted. First, seemingly frozen in time by COVID-19, and then torn up by its roots by the eruption of long unspoken racial tensions. Are you scared of the world you're entering? Anxious? Perhaps a little bit excited? I would understand if you're feeling any of these emotions right now. One thing we have all learned over the past 3 months is to expect the unexpected and to embrace change. You graduates have all grown up very quickly, as all young people do during times of great change. So let's now talk about one of the many social upheavals that we're experiencing. Let's talk about my favorite subject, infections. I want to consider 3 things. I want to consider vulnerable people, the microbiome, and vaccines. So infectious diseases. Illnesses transmitted from person to person or from our environment to ourselves. As a student of microbiology and infections, I quickly learned that one of the most sinister things about them is that they tend to target the most vulnerable people in our society, shining a spotlight right on those who are marginalized and voiceless. Throughout history, and as recently as my grandfather's generation, it was commonly expected that not all of one's children would live to adulthood. My grandfather grew up on a farm in Forsyth County, just west of Winston-Salem. 2 of his brothers died as young children, one from tetanus and one from influenza and subsequent bacterial pneumonia. a disease not too unlike our COVID-19. Today, each of these children, my great uncles, whom I never knew, would likely have survived, one through vaccination and one with antibiotics. As recently as the past few decades, children routinely died of measles and mumps and scarlet fever and other diseases that we no longer see today because of vaccines and other public health measures. Infections tell us that young children are vulnerable and need protection. So even today, it is right for us to pray for Judah Yonan and his complete recovery. What are other vulnerable groups? In the early days of my medical training, AIDS was a new and mysterious disease, seemingly coming from nowhere. It began to kill at first hundreds and then thousands and later millions of people across the globe, devastating people's immune systems and disrupting entire societies. It is true that some regions of sub-Saharan Africa have lost a complete generation to this horrible infection. As you look at the AIDS epidemic today, it continues to ravage vulnerable and needy people. In East Africa, AIDS primarily affects young, poor women, those who through social and economic powerlessness are unable to protect their own bodies and their own families. Infections tell us that the poor and powerless are vulnerable. Consider today and very close at home, who are those people in our society who are most likely to die of COVID-19? As I walk through the intensive care units and COVID wards at my own hospital, I see there the elderly and the prisoners. In our own state, this disease disproportionately affects African Americans and Hispanic populations. Infections tell us who are the most vulnerable in our society: the elderly, the prisoners, and those who are economically or socially marginalized. If there's one thing that has emerged from this horrible pandemic, it is that we can see many things more clearly today, things that can no longer be ignored. The social and economic disparities that we all knew existed, but now we see so much more clearly. Is it any wonder that throughout Scripture, God commands his people to take care of the widow and the orphan and the alien in their midst, to visit the prisoner, to care for the poor? God's heart has always been to consider the vulnerable and to care for them. And so the message I give you is not a new one, and it's not my message. I believe that we are called to a life to serve those who are vulnerable and hurting and needy. Now, graduates, I've often heard allusions to the St. David's bubble. I think this refers to a mistaken notion that you've been overly sheltered and protected from the brokenness of the world. However, I don't believe that. I believe that along with any privileges you have received, you have also heard the voices of brokenness in our society. So I want to reframe it. I don't think it's a St. David's bubble, but perhaps a St. David's incubator. In this place, you have been taught and encouraged and nurtured so that you can leave here and do the same for others. No longer children, you leave St. David's as adults. And I believe that you will leave here and fly. I know that each of you will use the gifts that you've been given, the agency that you have received, and you will do what in Hebrew rabbinical writings is referred to as tikkun olam, restorers and repairers of creation, tikkun olam, being agents of peace and hope to a world that is meant to be beautiful. Let's get back to infectious diseases. So graduates, I want to give you your last St. David's quiz. So does anyone know what the microbiome is? Do you know what that term means? The microbiome consists of those microbes that inhabit our body. It reminds us that we do not live in a sterile world. Our bodies are covered with bacteria and viruses and fungi and other microorganisms. Now, for all of you germaphobes, I want to comfort you. There's no reason to fear. Most often, our resident microbes live in a beautiful and symbiotic relationship with us. Your immune system and your very metabolism are continuously shaped by this rich group of microorganisms surrounding your body. Microbes are not some evil intention or they're resulting from the fall of man. They are an intended part of the goodness of creation, most often interacting with us in healthy ways. You may have heard it said that you have over 10 times more microbial cells in your body than human cells. How do you interpret this? I've heard people erroneously say that you are more microbe than human. Or perhaps that your behavior is mostly determined by the bacterial components of your gut. Almost like some bad alien movie from the 1950s. While I understand the math, I don't believe the final interpretation. You are more than a mere aggregation of cells. You are not here because of the random coming together of cosmic dust or primordial goo. You are fearfully and wonderfully made by a loving and powerful and personal God. The bedrock of the Judean-Christian view of men and women is that they are each created in the image of God. So how might this play out for you specifically, graduates? How might this assertion be challenged? I've heard colleagues in my own biology department equating plant behavior to human behavior, that somehow the colors that flowers use to attract pollinators, their behavior, is somehow indistinguishable from our own human decision-making and moral reasoning, our behavior. Now, I understand the basis for some of these statements. There is a pushback against what is known as human exceptionalism. And this pushback has a real basis given the ways that we have not honored our created world and each other. That challenges me. I want to learn to respectfully listen and engage in conversations with those who espouse ideas I have never heard, but I want to do so with wisdom and discernment. So as you graduates enter a new type of academy, be it college or the professional world, I do not want you to shy away from this type of interaction, even if it is a bit uncomfortable. Instead, I want you to listen to your colleagues and fellow students and professors, to ask honest questions and to seek honest answers about the natural world, about the justice system, about human societies and economic systems, to use logic and reason and to hone these important skills. If God is the God of reason and creation, he is not intimidated by honest inquiry. But I do want you to be wary of those whose sole intention is to confuse and to deceive. You should recognize and avoid ad hominem arguments in which debaters choose personal attacks when they have no logic to stand on. I'm not telling you anything new. These are all things that you've learned from Dr. Grosh and Dr. Greggs and Dr. and soon-to-be Dr. Carricker and Mr. Antiel, Mr. Whitworth, and others. I'm excited to see you even more fully engaging your minds and your hearts in the subjects in your new schools. What an exciting season you have in front of you. And as a teacher, I do have one little bit of advice. Go to class. Your teachers want to engage you and even get to know you. I love it when my students come up after class and talk to me. I love to get to know their names. I like it when they come to office hours, but not so much when they come off office hours, okay? And as outstanding as your online instruction has been over the past few months, and I hear from many in this community that the St. David's faculty has exceeded everyone in their exceptional teaching this season. But there's something important about face-to-face interaction with your classmates and your teachers. The last thing I want to discuss is something that has come up in countless conversations over the past 3 months in this COVID-19 era, the concept of vaccination. You've heard it said that our society will never really reopen again until people are protected against this infectious disease by an effective vaccine. So what is a vaccine. In simple terms, it's receiving something in a weakened form so that when you're exposed to the real thing, you're protected. Each year, you receive an influenza vaccine, a killed or weakened form of the virus that allows you to develop a heightened immunity against the real invader. We all long for something that will protect us from this novel coronavirus and allow us to interact again with people without fear of infection, and to allow those who are most vulnerable to reemerge into the joy of real community. But I want to expand this discussion just a bit. In addition to being vaccinated against bad things like viruses, we can also be vaccinated against good things. What do I mean by that? Too often I have seen students just like you who leave high school and home and allow their hearts to become hardened to very good news. Do you students really believe you are well loved? Or has your heart somehow been hardened against the truth of your great worth, of your family's love for you, of this community's love for you, of God's great love for you? Having heard this message of love, perhaps in a weakened form, you may somehow not fully believe it when you're sitting in a dorm room and experiencing major FOMO next year. When you consider the claims of your faith now as adults, are you going to simply reject overly simple ideas that perhaps you were told as children? Or are you going to dig into the richness of a faith that has sustained generations of people who are experiencing the highest of joys, as well as the most abject depression and rejection? As the psalmist says, do not harden your hearts. Do not allow yourself to be inoculated and vaccinated against the good news and the love that you have received. I wish that all of you could see what I'm seeing right now. I have the best seat in the house. I'm looking into the faces of men and women who are going to change this world. And these are not mere words. Students, you are entering a very accomplished and exceptional group of others who count themselves graduates of St. David's School. I'm looking at future teachers and pastors and parents and business leaders and chefs and governors, maybe a president. You are going to change this world in big ways, in small ways, in local ways, and in global ways. So, along with your families and your friends and your teachers, I send you out with great blessing. Thank you.